From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection with Al Page. Our guest is Penn Kimball, Professor Emeritus, Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and a visiting lecturer at the University of Washington.
A number of political candidates look and act like anchors on the evening news. Why is this so?
Well, I don't know. Nowadays, you know, if you run for public office, your whole campaign is television, and you begin getting interviewed practically, you know, the day you graduate from college and think you want to run for office somewhere. And if you do it enough times, you know, you get a certain amount of presence. I don't think it's as bad as you make it out to be, because I don't think that all our public officials serve some of these plastic men that some anchors become. But I think that they know their way around television, and they have to know their way around television, or you just cannot survive in politics these days.
But is there some kind of image or looks that look good on television?
Well, you know, I don't buy that theory, because there are a lot of different craggy types in the Congress of the United States. And I go back, you know, to the days of H.V. Kaltenborn, for example. You know, he had the worst voice in the world, and he somehow was very good on both radio and television. I think that what television likes to pick up the reality of somebody, and if a person is sort of a straight shooter and they have some character, he doesn't have to be an Errol Colorad. And I don't think that our politicians are all necessarily the handsomest people in the United States of America, nor do they all talk in pear-shaped tones all the time. But they're able to articulate what they really feel and get it across, and they learn how to speak it in a language that the average man can understand, and that is not all bad, in my opinion.
Be a little bit more specific. What kind of language or speech pattern works well on television?
Well, you know, you talk to me as if I were some television expert, you see, and here I am making a fool of myself with you here and not knowing anything about it. But what you learn, of course, in the business of educating young people who go into television, and the first thing that happens to you, that television language has to be short and concise, not necessarily oversimplified, but the long, graceful, beautiful sentences that you sometimes run for 4 pages in New Yorker magazine just don't play on television.
Now, why don't they play on television?
Well, it's just too complicated. I mean, it goes on, and you know, sometimes like speaking German, people wondering when the verb is going to come. And so you run out of breath. You know, sometimes I see some students in our television lab, you know, and they've written this wonderful lead which would be good for print, and right in the middle they take that big breath, you know, because they can't get to the end of the sentence. So you have to compress. And I don't think compression is necessarily bad, because some of the most beautiful writers in the world speak in very short, simple sentences.
Is there a limit to what the viewer can absorb? Is that part of the problem?
Well, I think so. That I find you know, people talk, what can the viewer absorb? You know, I can absorb the Chicago Bears if I have to. I can absorb Masterpiece Theater doing Nicholas Nickleby, which is quite complicated, and you have to cock an ear to it. And it's not that it's what the audience is willing to do. Television is kind of in competition for the attention of people who have got a million things to think about. And they don't have to sit there and listen to something that is dull, 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 or something that doesn't seem to be relevant to the life that they're living in. So that I think basically it's a question on television of having something to say that people care about, and they see some relevance in what is being said to their day-to-day life.
If television is in competition, must the candidate start out with a hook? Must the candidate grab the viewer with his or her first sentence?
I live in New York State, where Mario Cuomo is governor. Now, Cuomo electrified the Democratic National Convention last time out. He is not somebody who gives a grabber, you know. He is not Dick Van Dyke. He is a relatively homely man who speaks thoughtfully about things. You know, he talks about the family, and he talks about his immigrant background, and these are the kinds of things that people listen and say, hey, he came from a background like I did. He doesn't have to give you a grabber at the beginning. He's talking about something that people find interesting.
It provides an image that people can identify with.
Well, image that people can identify. You see, you're trying to force me to try to tell you that I think that television is all fakery and all these plastic people are around, you know, imitating TV anchormen. And I don't really believe that that's true. And I think television itself is proven in terms of people. You know, Ed Asner is no matinee idol, and he can be very successful on television. Bill Cosby, all right, he used to be a comedian. But the fact of the matter is he comes across as somebody, you know, that you'd like to listen to in your own living room. And I think that what television likes are people that have some reality and some sincerity to their makeup. And as I say again, is television is very impatient with people who are talking about things that they don't care about, because they can just click and they're gone.
They can't be a buffoon.
Well, no, buffoons are okay if they're enough of a buffoon, right? But if you're too much of a buffoon, you better not run for public office, because Adlai Stevenson learned that you know, trying to do humor in politics is a very risky business.
If candidates came to you who you did believe in to ask you how to be effective on television, what would you tell them?
Well, the first thing I say is, you know, learn to relax if you can. Don't listen to all these people that says there's this great unseen audience out there and that you've got to put a grabber up front and you've got to project some kind of an image. I would say you're going to get elected. And I worked for a couple of senators and a governor before television was all that important, but I was involved at the beginning of television. And it was very hard for them to not be scared to death and to try to be something different than they really were. And the biggest thing in the world is, what's the use of running for public office if you don't believe in something, if you don't want to get something accomplished? And if you believe in something and trying to get something accomplished, the way you do that is to persuade other people to follow your lead. And I think that somebody who wants to do that, whether he's running for president of the United States or sheriff, and he gets in front of a television camera. And
Sheriff
says,
of Nottingham.
you people ought to elect me because I pledge to you that I'm going to do so-and-so. And if he can get himself into a situation where he has a chance to explain it, he's okay. The trouble with television is it doesn't give the candidates any time. The only way that you can get on the air mostly in the American political system now is to buy political advertising, and that reduces itself to 15-second spots, 30-second spots, 1-minute spots, where that's the bang, bang, bang with the political consultants after you. And I think that's the thing that makes it tough.
I'll come back to that time issue in a moment. Is there a correlation between being effective on television and being a good politician, being a good leader?
Yes, I do. I mean, what's the good of being a leader if you can't persuade anybody to follow your lead? I mean, that's the name of the game. Now, I don't believe that if you look back through the history of our country, that Harry Truman was the most sophisticated kind of television performance. But he came across as what he was, a kind of a cantankerous, you know, show-me Missourian, and people responded to that. They used to make fun of Dwight Eisenhower because he never could have a verb in the middle of his sentences and he would wander off into outer space. But he just communicated trust and sincerity, and people went for that. John Kennedy, if you ever look back at the Nixon-Kennedy debates and so forth and listen closely, he was not really all that polished television. You know, he had that funny Boston accent. You know, he'd say Cuber, but somehow or other he had a style that worked very well. And on we go. You know, president after president, each one very distinct, one from another. But if the presidency is going bad, all your television skills in the world can't save it.
But let's push this a little bit more. Is there a correlation between being effective or looking good on debates, which you've just mentioned, and being a good politician, a good leader?
Yeah, I think debates are one of the most overrated forms of political coverage that there are. You know, Richard Nixon won all the debates at Whittier College, when you read his biography, and he was terrible at debating on television. He was terrible in a political sense. You know, debate, you're trying to score points, you're trying to jab at the other guy. Once in a while, when Walter Mondale sort of turned and said, "Where's the beef?" You know, that's pretty good in a television debate because the audience say, "Yeah, I wonder what he'll say to that." But Debates, by and large, are, if you're in a primary situation, there are too many candidates for anybody to finish more than 2 or 3 sentences. It's a back and forth, a jab and punch, and you don't really get any follow-up questions in which somebody can handle and talk about with any thought. I think debates serve a useful purpose where you kind of see how a guy reacts under pressure. But I don't think that you learn a lot from them. I mean, you know, again, I go back to the Kennedy-Nixon debates. You know, the great issue in the first debate between Kennedy and Nixon is Kimoy and Matsu. I mean, I don't think you can find anybody anymore that ever heard of Kimoy and Matsu, and it certainly was not the #1 issue in American foreign policy in the next 10 years.
But there's also an argument that Nixon lost those debates because he used the wrong kind of makeup.
There's all this rationalizing. After the candidates lose and the pundits go to it, all right, you can score them. Jerry Ford made a big gaffe about Poland. You know, he said the Soviet Union had no influence over Poland. But on the other hand, Ronald Reagan, first time out in the last election, the Wall Street Journal came out the next day and said, is Ronald Reagan still alive? He's showing his age, he's bumbling around. And he sort of came, you know, that didn't hurt a Reagan landslide. So if Reagan had lost, the pundits would have all written, Reagan showed his age on television, and that's what happened. We have too many people analyzing what the people thought happened when they looked at the television debate. And I don't think those things necessarily pan out.
But if you grant the point that debates have limited usefulness, why are they so popular?
Politics has become so confusing that people really are looking for something to grab onto that sounds like what their civics teachers told them politics ought to be. The debate, you know, they read about Lincoln Douglas, you know, that's the great historical tradition, man on man. Of course, Lincoln and Douglas, you would have been killed on television because they went on for hours and hours and hours, and the audience would be long gone to the game shows if you try to put on a Lincoln Douglas debate. But all the media hype it up. They say, here's going to be the confrontation. The media love conflict, you know, and one-on-one. It's kind of our American bullfight is what television debate is. So that the audience gets all built up. They've been bored to tears, a lot of them, about politics and haven't read that much about it. And they think they can get a quick fix and a quick tune in. They go in the debate and they say, now I'm an informed citizen a little bit. And I wonder what these guys will do. It's, you know, it's like a championship prize fight. It's everything that the fan, the political fan, goes into the debate, you know, and wonders whether the champ is going to keep the title or whether the underdog is going to score an early knockout. The press builds all that up, and so it's a lot of fun. You watch it and you see it, and everybody talks about it when it's all over. But the researchers are having a tougher and tougher time of proving that this is the thing that really motivates a person to vote.
If the same God-fearing, honest candidates that you advised earlier asked you how to look good during a debate, what would you tell them?
I'd say don't be thrown by the other guy jabbing at you. Of course, there's another thing that's a wonderful thing about television. I don't know that I should tell you this, but I wrote a book a couple of years ago, and I got on the circuit, you know, the Today Show and Good Morning America. And I found out that there were 2 or 3 things I wanted to say, and it didn't matter what the question was. I would say what I wanted to say, and the interviewer didn't even know the difference, you know? So what you tell the candidate is that those guys are not listening to you anyways. Figure out what you want to get across in this interview and find a way to give the answers that you gave in advance.
How would you advise a viewer who is watching debates what to look for?
Well, I don't want to counsel a viewer, you know, how to watch a debate. What I'm really trying to pushing for, I think that we ought to have in our political system a way that every candidate would have 5 minutes with the voters, which he uses the way he wants to use it. In 5 minutes, you can really say an awful lot about issues in terms of your own attitude towards public life, in terms of your own feelings about the country. And I keep coming back to this very important point. What's the use of running for public office unless you deeply believe in something and unless you believe that your presence in this office is going to make a difference, not to just your own ego, but in terms of the things that are important to society. And so when you're all done and you're ready to toss it in, you know, you say, hey, I did that, and that was one good thing to do. And I think if you have something to say on that ground and if somebody will give you a little time in order to get that across, that's what you're going to do. If they're going to make you debate, you say, well, that's a ritual which the media are imposing upon the candidate, which is not necessarily to the benefit of the knowledge of the voter, and try to come out alive. Don't get mad, right? Don't let them get your goat. Don't spend all your time answering the fellow that you're sitting there debating with. Basically, the debate is a format which you're talking to the people. And keep your attention on the audience, and what you're trying to say is don't get lost in personalities with the person that you're debating with. Now, I don't know. I've probably had more losers in politics than anybody that you know, so that's about what my advice is worth.
You raised the question of time once again, which I had promised earlier that we would get back to. There are a lot of shows on Sunday afternoon where people are, quote, interviewing in depth, quote, those candidates.
Wonderful programs. Everybody's out in the golf course or sailing their boats. And the reason those programs are on is you can't sell them for love or money because there isn't any audience. Now, you look at you look at Brinkley on ABC, or you look at Sunday Morning on CBS.
But it's claimed, according to the numbers, that David Brinkley gets 10% of the Washington, D.C. audience. That's a sizable number of people.
The terrible thing about television is very appreciable audiences don't add up. You know, it's not the greatest audience to sell soap flakes to. And the money comes from the people who are selling soap flakes. So that I think it's a perfect example that I think that if you had something well, 60 Minutes is another example. Nobody thought that a magazine fact show full of documentaries would ever make it into the top 10 on television on a Sunday night. And the interesting thing is that never would have happened if it hadn't been for the FCC. Because the FCC told CBS that if they didn't put some news and public affairs into the 7 o'clock time span on Sunday nights, they would have to yield the time to the local stations. CBS put on 60 Minutes. It got very small audiences to begin with, and people say, aha, see, nobody wants that kind of a show. But people found the show. When television never gives you very much chance to find the show. And gradually people respond to it. Now, I don't think Mike Wallace is the greatest and fairest interviewer in the world, but the stuff that's on that show isn't bad in terms of the serious issues of our time. So there is, I think, a perfect example that television does not have to be dreadful in order to build audience.
Well, if you don't like the Sunday afternoon time slot, let's move to the evening news. Let's move to prime time. How well do they cover the political beat on the evening news?
Look, an evening news show, it's 30 minutes on the evening news. It went from 15 minutes to 30 minutes a generation ago, you know, and they haven't been able to push it to an hour because the local affiliates make all their money out of 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and they're not going to yield any time to the network news show. And it isn't 30 minutes, it's 22 minutes. And so you're getting 22 minutes to try to cover everything on the planet. And if you ever go into the production room of an evening news show, they have a board. It's a headline board. And they know that they are going to work 10 or 11 headlines. You know, they touch base here and a flash here. And that's all they pretend to do. I remember when television first began to do news seriously, newspapers thought it was the end of the world. And what it turned out, television was the greatest thing that ever happened in newspapers because the evening news would whet the appetite. And then people would pick up their morning newspaper and try to find out, you know, more information about it. But in 30 minutes, trying to cover the whole world, you can't do very much. On the other hand, McNeil Lehrer, I think, in an hour or more, have demonstrated on public television the possibilities. They do a news rundown at the top of their show. They pause and get in some depth the 3 or 4 basic issues that are going on. And I think that that's a kind of a pattern that under our broadcast system ought to be encouraged on prime time for mass audience. And I think it would keep an audience there, but the broadcast organizations won't let that happen because I don't think they would get the kind of an audience that you could sell for the maximum buck.
But why is that true? Why couldn't they get that kind of audience for a McNeil Lehrer format?
Because they don't give it a chance. In the same way, I say 60 Minutes never got a chance. Well, they didn't want to have Hill Street Blues on. You know, it took a good man running NBC to give Hill Street Blues enough time to build enough audience for people to find it on the dial. And television executives are all cowards. I mean, they really are scared to death. They don't seem to have any opinions about anything. And all this year's program represents last year's successes. And the minute there's a little dip in the ratings, off with their heads. And that is the spirit of the marketplace. Dog eat dog. Nobody dares to have any patience. And for a network to be a hero under the present system and to put on a very good show in prime time, the competition is going to kill them. And the only way to make them do that is for the FCC to say, we're not going to let schlock television take unfair competitive advantage of someone who tries to do a responsible job. And you've all got to do this or you're going to lose your licenses.
Let's talk about another way that television covers the political beat, the televised press conference. Does that provide a public service, or is that another form of showbiz?
I was a Washington correspondent when Franklin D. Roosevelt was president.
But you were very, very young.
And I was very, very young, and I could belly up to the desk, right? And he would be as close to me as you are, and there would be 20 people in the room. And he would they would have a back and forth, and it was nice and easy, and no one was trying to make sure that their Aunt Susie saw them back home on the tube. And with the advent of television, and now this huge gang and herd of reporters there, it's not a press conference anymore. It's very unfair to the president, I think. He's getting bombarded. You don't know whether it's someone for real, or they've had people coming in from spurious networks asking questions. And I think it's just lost its meaning. It does show you how the top man reacts under pressure, but it also, I think, is largely responsible for some of the ill will the press has created. Because you see a bunch of this mob of reporters, just beating up on the President of the United States, and I don't think it's a very pleasant sight. I think they ought to split the press conference in two, and they ought to have one for the print media with no lights and no camera, in which they have a chance to engage in a little thoughtful exchange, and the bosses are not back home making sure their correspondents are getting on the air. And then let the television have their press conference separate and play the television game. And I don't fault television for not doing as good a job as they should do, apart from the technological limitations. It's just very hard to keep a press conference going long enough with a whole bunch of people asking different kinds of questions. It becomes very confusing, and that doesn't make good television material.
In general, what is your opinion of the kind of questions that reporters ask? Are they good? Are they bad?
Well, again, you see, I'm a television educator, quote unquote, or a retired television. What we always tell us, there's this guy, who shoves the microphone into your nose and say, how do you feel just as you watch your child drop 44 stories to the ground, and there's too much of that in television. Sticking the mic up, asking for a quick reaction, and invasions of privacies, and so forth. You see it very strongly, and I do not like to knock local television, but if you're on a campaign and you ride in with a candidate into Wichita or somewhere, and the local TV comes up, and they say, Mr. President, did you have a good breakfast, so the interview kind of goes from there. They're so awed. They have not followed politics before that day. They don't have any framework to ask a question in. So that they fill all the time, that some of the traveling correspondents who know what they're talking about don't even get on air with that. And now we're getting more and more in the situation where candidates run away from television. They're only giving their media event for the day in which they can tell their story off a small soundbite with gorgeous pictures in the background. And the press watches all that from afar.
You find that reporters are interested more in getting some kind of exclusive as opposed to asking a really interesting question.
No, I don't think, it's very few, there isn't any exclusivity in politics anymore. I mean, the good reporters, and there are a lot of good reporters out there, and as I said, but the thing that frustrates them is it's very hard for them to get the politicians to stand still long enough to give them thoughtful answers to thoughtful questions. It's also bang, bang, bang. They're very smart. Some of the best students I ever had are on television. Don Oliver on NBC and Susan Spencer on CBS, for example. I need to name a couple. Robin Lloyd, who got his start in Seattle after he came out of the Columbia School of Journalism, is covering the White House for NBC. I know those people. as individuals that they were thoughtful, serious students of what goes on. When they get into a campaign situation, you can just see them getting sucked up like a tornado with the rest of the stuff, and all of a sudden they get to be, you know, television reduces everybody to the least common denominator. I think the reporters are good. I think the questions are available to them. What we need is the format. And the format can't get on the air because of commercial pressures. And the way you relieve commercial pressures is to have the Federal Communications Commission make sure that television is run in the public interest, necessity, and convenience like the law says. And then I think we'll have a happier situation all around.
But do you find reporters always looking for conspiracies?
People in the absence of understanding tend to think that they're being manipulated, there are evil forces at work. And pretty soon the whole governmental system is losing its credibility. And pretty soon the legitimacy of government is sort of threatened by the fact that people don't have the trust anymore that is absolutely essential in the kind of democracy that we live in.
From your perspective, from being the first reporter that covered Moses,
I wasn't quite alive, but almost.
Is television gradually getting better in covering political news, or is television becoming gradually worse in covering political news?
You know, if you back off, everything is better than it used to be. Students, everybody says the students have all gone to hell. They can't spell anymore, they can't read anymore. I mean, students are much brighter now than they were 10 years ago. The newspapers and television are much better than they were 10 years ago. You have a whole professional cadre of people who, you know, take their jobs very seriously in trying to bring truth out of what is happening. And as a matter of fact, I think that if you go back and look at Torchlight Parade, you know, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and that sort of thing, that wasn't a great intellectual dialogue in politics. Then politics, I think, is serious. We're doing a pretty good job on it. We do a little better job every year. I'm sort of optimistic with the breakup of networks and in the fragmentation of the audience. And you get more specialized television and cable and public television and so forth. There's going to be audiences like specialized magazines came along when the General Magazine collapsed. They're going to be able to cover things in depth for audiences that have special interest in it. So you see, I'm an old-fashioned liberal optimist and think we're going to be okay.
Penn Kimball, Professor Emeritus, Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and a visiting lecturer at the University of Washington, upon reflection.